hi, journeyers. It's a great day to visit and explore religions in New York City. I'm Tony Carnes, your host for A Journey Through NYC Religions Television. A while back, we had Renn, an urban analyst, to come talk about the post-pandemic church and the leadership that's needed for religious groups after the pandemic. It was so interesting that we had him back to come talk about his other big interest, and that is families, marriage, and society. So I really appreciate you coming back, Renn, and I look forward to your next work.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you. I noticed that you have a nostalgia for the old WASP establishment churches, but it seems like it. I have some questions about whether.
Well, I don't know about the churches per se, but that was it was very interesting. There's a symbol. I mean, all those mainline churches going back to the turn of the century, the leadership class of these Protestant denominations were far, far, far to the left of the congregations that they led. And I mean, really, in many cases, on the kind of vanguard left of the country in a lot of ways.
But that may be why they ended up failing in the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah, well, they actually were doing quite well in the 50s. I mean, that was really their high watermark. They started going.
In the 50s, they did, but you could see by the 1957, when Billy Graham came in, the Council of Churches here in New York said, we're in real trouble.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, I think there was something to that. I mean, there was this, study. Like, I think a lot of people converted into those churches as they sort of moved up in society. And I think that sort of ended around that time frame. People no longer, it was no longer, once the WASP once this idea that the Episcopalians were at the top of the pecking order sort of went away socially, or even became a little bit kind of like frowned upon, people didn't aspire to join the Episcopal Church when they got rich anymore. So I think there was a sense in which these guys were replenishing their coffers through upward socioeconomic mobility. And that kind of stopped. And they were also very aggressive. I'm quoting this from some study I got. Is they were very aggressive. Their congregations were much more aggressive users of birth control. They had fewer kids, and then their kids largely abandoned, did not retain the faith.
You also have on the other side of the establishment is the Catholic Church, which has undergone tremendous challenges, generational challenges, and also ethical challenges. Do you think they're recovering, and will they recover and become appealing to the masses like in Indianapolis or New York?
I think the flow of evangelical converts, there's like a flow of evangelical converts into Catholicism. I think it's becoming much more likely that you go into Eastern Orthodoxy now. I mean, that's been coming on strong. It used to be.
Why is that?
I don't know all the answers, but I think there's probably a sense. One, I do think it's theologically more acceptable to a Protestant to join the Eastern Orthodox Church because so much less is dogmatized there. It's a much less theological tradition, I think, in that sense. And for example, all the Mariology, they believe it, but it's not dogmatized, such as and to be a Catholic, you have to basically, technically, you have to assent to everything that's in the catechism, 100%. The Orthodox Church has far less dogma in that sense. It's much more, I think much more that a religion of practice or a pattern of living, in that. So I think it's a little less theologically objectionable to certain amounts of, like a lot of Roman Catholics, my impression would be the average Catholic doesn't worry. If you're a cradle Catholic, you don't worry too much about whether you agree with everything in the catechism or not. For someone such as myself, I would not, say I agree to this thing and join the Catholic. If I joined the Catholic Church, I wouldn't do it unless I could legitimately subscribe to the body of doctrine that I'm required to subscribe to. And I think that's a barrier to Protestants. And I definitely think the abuse scandal has really turned a lot of people off. And then, this perception that Francis is a leftist, I think many of the conservatives are sort of alienated from it. So I'm not saying that the flow of conversions into Catholicism has declined necessarily, but I do see like apparently the Antiochian Orthodox Church is now majority converts. And there's some of these churches that are becoming much less ethnically bound, many more converts into Orthodoxy. It seems, I don't think Rod Dreher making his way into Orthodoxy is like an isolated event.
Right.
I think it's much more, there's much more of that case now that people are looking at.
There is another aspect, but it has some cultural implications. The Catholics and the evangelicals, and I would say conservative Orthodox Jewish groups, really think about bringing their faith perspectives to guide their politics and social policies. Orthodoxy seems to say, no, we, at least for some, is withdrawal from the world. And I just got to get out of that. I can't stand all that. So is what happening really also a sort of you could call it either a withdrawal from political conflict, or you could call it a loss of nerve? And saying, I hear a lot of the Orthodox people that go in the Orthodoxy saying, the West is doomed. There's no hope. We just got to go into the monastery and get ready for the Dark Ages. I don't think evangelicals and Catholics or Orthodox Jews are going to say that. They're going to say, so to me, are there constructive constructive ways those three groups can recover their social cultural presence? And do we really want that, of course?
Yeah, I would say, again, I think Rod has basically said explicitly, one of the things he likes about the Orthodox Church is there is no cultural presence in America. And that it is kind of escape. I don't know. I think a lot of people do think that the Orthodox are going to be the last man standing in terms of holding to their beliefs, that they're not going to liberalize, to the extent that, some of these other denominations may. Now, I think, again, in practice, the OCA many of the OCA parishes and such are very liberal, so I don't know that's necessarily true.
They're liberal, and also some of the conservatives think Saint Vladimir Putin is a very good leader.
Yeah, well, it depends. It depends what you mean by a good leader. So it's like there's like a lot of people who you could recognize. Napoleon was a good leader, but that doesn't mean that I have to approve of Napoleon. In some respects. So I think you do have to distinguish as someone an effective leader versus whether they are the kind of leader we need. No, we don't need a Putin in America. I can tell you that. Yeah. So I think it's I think it's an interesting time. That's all I can say. I definitely think that. Where I agree with Rod Dreher is I think that the church is internally very weak and dysfunctional in the United States. And that is a bigger problem than fighting politics in terms of, I think the kind of abuse scandals, writ large, which have been very large in the, in the Protestant world isn't quite sexual abuse in the same way that it has been in the Catholic Church, but look at what's happened at Hillsong. Look at what happened with Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill. Look at what happened with James McDonald. Look at what happened with a lot of these churches. So there's been a lot of scandals there, many of which were essentially known about and swept under the rug for a very long time. And when one of these churches blows up, kind of their pastor gets airbrushed out of the Politburo photo. And it's like, well, we're not going to talk about them anymore, but we're going to go on as if nothing happened.
Well, the question is what to do with their books.
Right. All the books that you blurbed and endorsed and all that stuff like that. And so there's all that stuff that's been out there. So I think there's that. I think the kind of the moralistic therapeutic deism thing. There was just some survey recently that only 6% of people in the evangelical world actually believe with all these like, you know, basic Christian.
The real question is, if what's a true evangelical sociologically? That is, what does commitment mean? And then you can go back and say, well, that commitment is strong, because they by the way, Barna interprets that the lack of knowledge means that commitment's not strong. I don't think he shows that at all. He doesn't have a commitment question on there, except for a church attendance, which is not affected by those 9 things.
Well, I would say if you look at the Protestant system and the kind of evangelical system, you know, if doctrine doesn't matter in that system, then it really is kind of a sociological phenomenon.
Well,
really, it's
this is true actually, and true in every church, every time. I remember.
Well, I think it's different though in the Catholic and Orthodox Church, which is a sacramental system. You know, you're participating in the sacramental life of the church is probably as, okay, we got a Catholic on here can answer me, but I've always said that it's like, you know, it's something that like, you don't have to have an IQ of 115 to be a Catholic, because you can participate in the sacramental life of the church, even if you're someone with an IQ of 80 who can't understand any of these doctrines. So there's a different, there's a physical element. I think Charles Taylor was devastating on this point when he talks about the excarnation of Protestantism, and it reduces faith to essentially a set of mental propositions and an inward kind of inward motivations. And if you don't believe in actual propositions, then, you know, then what do you believe in? I
don't think that's how humans work. You know, identity, you can have identity and affiliation and a strong identity with a particular position. All through history, we've noticed this, and it gets rediscovered, and it in almost every decade. Going back to the Catholic Church, when they were first thinking about they needed an inquisition, and which really meant, first of all, to inquire, what do people really believe? And they sent a priest out to a village. It's a famous, that's been published in a book study. Sent a priest out to look at villages in southern France of what Catholics really believed. And he comes back and he says, they believe nothing. They believe nothing. They are, you know, Cathars, and they are, you know, this or that. And what he didn't understand, and the church's the hierarchy, theologians don't understand, is that people approach their doctrine in a different manner, a different way. And now sometimes 2 things that, one is that they will learn about their doctrine if somebody tells them this is really important, they need to learn it. So really, if you find people don't know something, maybe you're just finding that the leaders haven't taught it very well, haven't made the sense that it's important.
I'd agree with that.
And that doesn't mean that their followers aren't there, and that if they were taught well, or they were persuaded that these things they need to know, they wouldn't do it. And so that Barna, all he shows is that the teaching, he shows, number one, the church, this is true, by the way, the evangelical church, except for Puritan times, which it was much more, the beliefs were much more thorough, but even there you find, as you go down, the beliefs were more simple. You had also the study of Willow Creek. They just studied something called the Resolve studies. They surveyed their network, and they found out that the big problem was that the leadership itself was no longer challenged by the teaching, and was sort of bored. And of course, we know now there were other problems, but and that a real problem was that the church needed to really get more deep into biblical and doctrinal areas, so to keep the challenge to the leaders, who then would take that challenge to the congregation. So it sort of depends on what your model of belief in a religion is. Yes, there is a difference between sacramental, that is, the ritual center doesn't require as much doctrinal cognition, But as many people notice that the evangelical church is also its own type of ritual center. And
right. I mean, I don't deny that that's all true sociologically. I'm just talking about this. If you really look at it as, or as a community, sure, these identities, yeah, I agree with that. So if you look at it, it's like if you look at it as a truly religious, so yeah, I think it's kind of interesting what constitutes Christianity in a Protestant sense. If all the doctrines, if you take all the doctrines off the table.
I also think that it is true that I think also something that has been a weakness among some Protestant teaching is the actual sort of teaching about Christ and living out his life in the church. Now you think, oh, well, they do that all the time. But I think of, how many, the way I would put it is how many Mother Teresas do we find in the Protestant churches? Not so many. People that you just so admire. Billy Graham was admired because he had integrity. He preached an optimistic gospel, and he seemed very open. But I don't see that we have these cultural heroes of people that just live out Christ's life and that has this big impact. Am I wrong on that?
No, I think the people who come close to it are the new monastics, to some extent. Although their public persona is very hyper political, I think. But if you actually looked at someone like how Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove was actually living his life down there in North Carolina, I think you'd see there's elements of that.
That may be the strength of the new monasticism, something that just the strength of being an exemplary life.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I'd agree with that. I think the other thing that's weak about the church is, our sexual economy is totally in ruins. I think in a lot of ways.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, again, you don't like Barna, but if you look at all the surveys that have just come out about essentially now a majority of evangelicals believe that casual premarital sex is okay. Yeah. I think you certainly have lots of, you have lots of people who are watching porn, who are having premarital sex. Family formation rates are not that great, even in the church. To the point that the church itself is embracing a post-familial theology. Divorce rates very high. I think, there's a lot of that. I think that, could be fixed. But I think that's kind of fundamental.
I think part of that is the church, it thought they could promote marriage by promoting the ideal, when most marriages are not ideal. Really, the churches need to promote how do you cherish a less than ideal marriage. Because you look at all of these seminars and stuff, this is how you're going to get, the marriage of your dreams, right?
Yeah.
But that is not where most marriages are. There's lots of emotional entanglement, lots of failure. There's successes too. But I don't see, now, you know this much better than me. So I'm just, I don't see that most of our teaching about marriage, really, it's based on, we're going to teach you the ideal. We're not really teaching how to cherish the normal. Am I wrong?
Yeah, you could, there's probably some of that. I do think there is an almost, prosperity gospel element, yeah. I think, or air of prosperity gospel, or kind of word faith. If you are the man God calls you to be, your wife is obviously going to want to have a lot of sex with you, right? That's basically, that's almost, there's a lot of de facto if then kind of logic to it. So there's a lot. I have a lot of criticisms. Of it. We can't necessarily always go into now, but I think it's there. Among other things, the church has basically made peace with the divorce revolution. There's no, there's certainly no advocacy anywhere that we should, do anything to reform no-fault divorce laws, for example. So they're totally, I think they're very at peace with kind of the modern, regime on a lot of things.
Well, I think it, as I say, I think it goes back before that. That is, and this that people, a lot of younger people are not getting married because they think they need to try it out because they've seen their parents' marriage not being so good, and they think, well, I need to be tentative. And I think there's also the temptation of pleasures and so forth. But
well, if you're a man too, you see that, oh yeah, my dad got ripped over in divorce court. I'm not signing up for that. I think the reality is, there's like dozens of like these men's YouTubers and all this stuff telling you like, don't get married. You're an idiot to get married. If you get married and have kids, then basically your wife can essentially ruin your life at any time, which isn't entirely untrue. I think they exaggerate it. They underestimate the benefits of marriage. I'm a big advocate for marriage, but I think there is a sense in which a lot of men are like thinking like, you gotta steer clear of anything that could, get the legal system involved in your life in a very negative way.
Well, some
like having kids
might say that this was a strength of the Catholic Church, that all this compromise on marriage and so forth is because the evangelical Protestants don't have dogma that is rooted in a faith, belief that's been taught for thousands of years, and so it's easy to sort of get swept into or be enamored by the current trends of the age, and make your decisions based on that. Do you think that's a good argument?
Yeah, there may be something to that. I don't know. I do think that Rusty Reno of First Things wrote an article once talking about bourgeois Christianity, and that's essentially kind of what evangelicalism is, kind of the religion of sort of a bourgeois suburbanite kind of American. Maybe in the way, maybe there's a similar role there that there would have been in the mainline churches in the 50s or something like that. I think there's definitely a different feel in these fundamentalist churches in kind of rural and lower status areas. So it's really hard to say, but I think there is, I do think, and again, in the Protestant world, where you've essentially eliminated the sacramental system, maybe Lutheranism, put that aside. It's like, there's that thing, but like ultimately you eliminate the sacramental system, you eliminate a lot. And, if you eliminate the dogma too, what do you have left?
Pope Paul VI, I think Paul VI said that he wrote the Humanae Vitae, and he said, I predict that the marriages will start breaking down because they're not rooted in this long tradition. That was his apologetic, I think. And you also bring out something else. The richer you are, the more marriages hold together. It's at the bottom where the marriages are falling apart.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
And in some sense, ironically enough, Donald Trump, much married, much divorced, was able to appeal to that large group, particularly males, who are basically, just living singly and divorced, and I guess to females too. So he did show that there's a need to appeal there. But of course, he didn't have much solution for them.
Right. No, he did not. That's for sure.
But he did appeal to them, and he also appealed to. So I wonder if there's something to be learned about how to, if we wanted to knit together marriaes, of looking at the Trumpian rhetoric and appeal and see if there's anything there that we can use. Because, you know, most of the pastors are trained in seminary, they have master's degrees and stuff. They're totally incompetent to relate to a blue collar worker.
Well, here's what I would say, and I actually have to wrap up here in just a minute. But what I'd say is, number one, most Protestant ministers, my observation is they tended to marry very young, often marrying like the first or second person they dated. So you know, they're outside the norm. If you read the average Christian marriage book, it actually is they're often surprisingly not great reps for what they're promoting. You know, Russell Moore wrote this book called The Storm-Tossed Family. Yeah. It's like, you know, that your house is being tossed on the sea in the cover. And so they make marriage sound very unappetizing, I think, in a lot of ways. You know, you said they do talk about the ideal, but I think there's a sense in which a lot of pastors, they're the ones that are constantly dealing with the problems. You know, people with happy marriages don't come to the pastor for counseling, right? Whereas the people who had affairs, you know, all this stuff, that's when they get involved. So they see it at its worst, I think, in a lot of ways, disproportionately. So I think they really are unequipped. I think if you look at it, what we see is, you know, somebody like the Mormons do a much better job of presenting a very positive vision of family life. Now, maybe it's not perfect or whatever, but go look up some of those family photos of like Mitt Romney's family, their Christmas cards or whatever. You're like, man, that's a great family. What you see is like in our society, you've got like the New York Times. Go do a search on polyamory on the New York Times. They're like repping polyamory hard. Anything other than, you know, a traditional heterosexual marriage with, you know, kids is going to be glamorized, and, you know, kind of the you know, kind of traditional or default path sort of like minimized, or you hear about the negatives of it. So I think to some extent we do have to talk a little bit about the positives of. I think we do need to talk about the positives of marriage. Yes, we don't want to glamorize too much the soulmates and all that stuff, but I would say there's you know, we have to, you know, we also have to kind of market the product a little bit. Right. We have to market
Aaron,
the product.
Let me interject here, and I'm going to give close us out. My name's Tony Carnes. I'm your host for A Journey Through Religions Television. We have been talking again with Aaron Renn, an urban analyst, and also a shrewd perceiver of marriages and families today. Thank you.